Greetings, my fellow Americans. This is H.J. Armstrong, citizen, scholar, saint. Currently, I am researching and formulating the bull-queer theory of history, a revolutionary new way to understand American history and politics. Today, I would like to share my research on a lost wrestling storyline by head writer, Vince Russo. Russo wrote for WWF at the height of its popularity in the Attitude Era, before he moved on to WCW and TNA. Famously, Vince Russo shocked the wrestling world by defecting from WWF to WCW on October 3, 1999, a time when the two companies were at the height of the so-called Monday Night War, a battle for ratings supremacy. However, Russo has not been entirely forthcoming about how he effected this transition. In Russo's version of events, he only began job hunting after McMahon failed to offer him either more time off or additional compensation at a time when he was asking Russo and the other writers to prepare not only Monday Night Raw but also Thursday Night SmackDown. WCW traveled less and their schedule would allow Russo to spend more time with his family. However, this story leaves out much of the context and it is an attempt by Russo to babyface himself. The truth is that Russo had been discontent for months and that he had been in contact with WCW officials in Atlanta for some time. Not only was he speaking with Eric Bischoff and other high officials in WCW, but he was providing sample storylines to display what he could do. Through careful interviews with WCW officials and well-connected fans from the era, I have reconstructed Vince Russo's pitch to WCW from the summer of 1999. It was, without a doubt, the best storyline ever written by Russo and one which really set up Russo to have a contentious relationship with a number of key figures in the company. Russo explained to WCW that much of the success that WWF had achieved owed to its edgier, grittier presentation. If they wanted to regain the lead in the Monday Night Wars, they would need to take big risks and create new major stars. Russo said that the biggest driver of ratings and the avatar of the Attitude Era was Goldust, portrayed by Dustin Rhodes. Goldust was an aggressive homosexual cast in the mold of Marilyn Manson. By the standards of the day, Goldust was a natural heel, but a heel who drew a lot of attention. This is why Russo pushed hard for, and got, Rhodes to WCW, where he briefly played Seven. Seven was Goldust on steroids. Seven was promoted in vignettes outside of children's windows. Some people in the company began to feel that Seven was being portrayed as a child molester, and this led Dustin Rhodes to refuse to portray the character. This was also not long after the John Benet Ramsey murder, so a number of people were worried that this was too edgy even for professional wrestling. Rhodes denounced the character, along with his previous Goldust persona, and went on to be a boring generic cowboy. Russo, offended that his creative ideas were being rejected, didn't come up with anything else good for Dustin Rhodes. This explains why Dustin's wrestling career fell far short of both his father and his younger brother. One wonders what would have happened if the company had just trusted the instincts of the man who had inaugurated the hottest period in the history of the business. Russo was convinced that the key to beating WWF was to get a better homosexual angle. However, this was still the 1990s and WCW was based in Atlanta. Due to the homophobia of the era, few wrestlers were eager to take up the mantle of a gay character. Accordingly, Russo decided to aim big. To make this angle work, Russo wanted someone who was colorful, charismatic, and good in the ring. In other words, someone who was capable of becoming a main eventer. He looked at the mid-card of WCW and identified one man as standing head and shoulders above the rest, Disco Inferno, portrayed by Glenn Gilberti. Disco Inferno already coded as potentially gay given his love of disco dancing. Turning him gay would not be too much of a stretch and it could be done with some subtlety. Russo also knew that Disco was creative, open-minded, and understood storytelling. However, to get Disco over as a main eventer, he would need the endorsement of someone more accomplished. In this case, Russo was looking for someone not to mentor Disco, but to be his love interest. Only a strong male influence could get Disco to focus more on winning than dancing. Russo thought that the best man for the job was the greatest wrestler of all time, Hulk Hogan. In the summer of 1999, Hogan had left his Hollywood persona behind and resumed wearing the classic red and yellow. While he was in big matches, he did not really have a clear direction. Further, Hogan joining the NWO in 1996 had been a huge risk and it had paid off massively. Russo knew that if anyone could pull off a major character reinvention, it was Hulk Hogan. The idea is that the two would have their first official encounter following a match where Disco had gained the edge, only to lose his focus and get crushed while disco dancing. Russo thought that it would work best if Disco had the upper hand on Goldberg, only to then throw away such a rare opportunity to eat a jackhammer. Hogan then comes out on the mic to chastise him, tell him that he has talent and potential, and invite him back to the locker room. At first, Hogan and Disco would be portrayed as a mentor and junior colleague. The difference is that they would maintain eye contact for a little too long or be seen entering and leaving rooms together. The signs of their relationship would be subtle, with both beginning to dress a little more fancifully over time. Hogan would win the title again and Disco would be instrumental to either his title win or a grueling defense. At the end, in celebration, Hogan was to grab and passionately kiss Disco Inferno in the middle of the ring. After this, Hogan would feud with Scott Steiner, who would verbally eviscerate the happy couple. This would probably put Hogan and Russo as the heels, but not entirely. The complicated ethics of gay Hogan versus Steiner would create conflicting sympathies among the audience, generate controversy, and attract eyeballs. This would eventually culminate in a dramatic betrayal by Disco, who would seize the big gold belt and go find a new boyfriend. Now, Disco Inferno would be established as a main eventer and a hot heel. This idea laid out a complete arc and would have certainly generated the kind of controversy that wrestling relied upon at the time to generate viewership. However, as was often the case in the late 1990s, Hulk Hogan exercised his creative control clause to nix the idea. According to my source, Bischoff was impressed by Russo's pitch and he met with Hogan to get his approval, but Hogan's face said it all. It is unclear if the idea was ever broached to Disco Inferno, although for reasons we will get to later, it is likely that Hogan believed that Gilberti was the author of the idea. My source insists that despite the later heat between Russo and Hogan that Bischoff did not present Russo as the father of this idea that Hogan found so offensive. With Hogan uncooperative, Russo tried to salvage the idea by substituting the Hulkster for another major established star. He went to Bischoff and proposed running with the same storyline, but with Bret Hart or Randy Savage playing the mentorship role. Given that neither of them was slated to carry the strap in late 1999 or early 2000, this would not be as effective, but it could still put Disco Inferno in the main event. However, it appears that it was at this point that Bischoff decided to kill the idea. Unfortunately, once he was officially hired, Russo would generate no other ideas with so much creativity, heart, or potential. Much of the blame lies with WCW management and with the short-sighted wrestlers, such as Hogan, who were too worried about what worried for their egos and not what was best for business. WCW folded in early 2002, after an abysmal downfall which began in earnest in 2000. In those dying days of WCW, Russo cut a scathing promo on Hogan, which resulted in a lawsuit from Hogan. Russo also made himself WCW champion in order to spite Hogan and Bischoff. One wonders how much this animosity was driven by Hogan's indignation at Russo's idea and Russo's fury that Hogan had shot down his best storyline. In 2003, when Vince McMahon was trying to acquire all of the recently released talent from WCW, he interviewed Russo. When Russo proposed bringing in Gilberti as part of the writing staff, McMahon mentioned a widespread rumor that Gilberti had proposed a Martian invasion angle back in WCW. The Martian invasion angle was an obvious joke, but many of the powers that be in WCW had chosen to pretend that it was a real idea and that it was proof of Disco Inferno's incompetence. Given that Hogan and McMahon had a long history of using steroids and doing cocaine together, it is likely that the Hulkster had directly poisoned the mind of the chairman of the board against the disco-dancing wrestler and writer. Unfortunately, we will never know the true power of Vince Russo as a storyteller. The relationship between Disco Inferno and Hulk Hogan would have been a legendary pairing, and one can only imagine the kinds of amazing promos that Scott Steiner would have cut at their expense. What we need is for the men involved with this to be forthcoming while they are all still alive and active. This is one of the best stories in wrestling history, and it is needlessly languishing in obscurity. Vince Russo, Hulk Hogan, Disco Inferno, Dustin Rhodes, Eric Bischoff, and Vince McMahon need to comment on this great storyline which never came to be and let the public know why it never came to be.